Welcome to 929's 24 books in 24 days. We're counting down until Pesach, and I am here to bring you the prophet Ezekiel, the most dangerous man in the Bible. Let's see if I can do this.
Picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies.
The music, the psychedelic music, is meant to evoke the atmosphere of Ezekiel, which is not only the most dangerous book, the most dangerous man in the Bible, but a particularly trippy psychedelic book filled with visions and filled with ideas that are dangerous. Why dangerous? Well, I have a wonderful teacher, Rav Pinchas Giller, who taught me at the American Jewish University. And Rav Giller says that there's no word more frum, no word more pious than dangerous. Dangerous is something that threatens to overturn received ideas that keep the lid on the apocalyptic potential of so much of religion. And that is exactly what Ezekiel threatened to do. Let's take a look at, before we get into the substance of Ezekiel, let's take a look at some early remarks about the danger that the book posed. Here we have in front of us a short little section from the Bavli, from the Talmud Bavli, which gives us some insight into just how threatening Ezekiel was. We have here a story of Rav Yehuda, who praises a man named Hananiah ben Chizkiah. Interesting that Hananiah ben Chizkiah has the same name as Ezekiel. Chizkiah and Yechezkel are more or less the same name. Here's what Hananiah ben Chizkiah did. Rav Yehuda said, truly that man is remembered for good, and his name is Hananiah ben Chizkiah. As were it not for him, the book of Yechezkel, of Ezekiel, would have been suppressed. She'il melehu nignaz sefer Yechezkel, formally suppressed, not included in the biblical canon at all. Why? Shehayu dvarav sotrin divrei Torah, because its words contradict words of Torah or principles of Torah. And how exactly did Hananiah ben Chizkiah salvage this amazing book? Me'asa he'elu lo shalosh me'ot garve shemen. So they, presumably the rabbis or maybe Team Ezekiel, brought Hananiah 300 jugs of oil for light and food up to his upper story where he worked, v'yashav, and there in this upper story he worked, and udarashan. So what Hananiah did was he interpreted the book of Chizkiyahu homiletically. It tried to reconcile it evidently with received opinion so as to diffuse some of what made the book so threatening. We don't have very much of what Hananiah ben Chizkiah did, his work, but we do have some ideas about what it was that made Ezekiel quite so threatening. Much of his vision contradicts the subsequent history as we know it, particularly the history of the temple. And as we're going to see, the whole core of what makes Yechezkel, what makes Ezekiel, threatens to undermine much of what the rabbinic Judaism takes for granted as orthodox, maybe small o orthodox, necessary. So let's say a few words about who Ezekiel was and about his life. Ezekiel was a priest who served in the first temple, in Solomon's temple. And when King Jehoiakim was captured by the Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar II, and carried off into exile. This is before the temple itself was destroyed. Chizkiyahu ben Buzi was carried off into exile with him to the north, to Babylonia, where he was settled with a few thousand of the elite of the kingdom of Yehuda, outside, it seems, of this city named Nippur, an ancient city that goes all the way back to Sumer and sat on the Euphrates River. He, in particular, was in a small canal that he makes reference to, running off of the city of Nippur in a city called Tel Aviv. The city that we call Tel Aviv derives its name ultimately from the city in which Ezekiel settled. He lived there in exile for the rest of his life. Evidently was a kind of a communal leader at times throughout his book. He describes himself sitting in front of the assembled elders of Judah, of the kingdom of Judah. So he was a person of stature, and he was a complete weirdo as well. He did many strange things in the course of his life. When his wife died, he went silent for over a year. At times, he describes himself cooking meat over embers of dung. He has, as we're about to see, visions that throw him to the ground, ecstatic visions that he himself can't understand immediately. We don't know much about his death, but we do know that he lived not only through that first exile, but through the ultimate destruction of the temple. That's a little bit about his biography. And we have a few questions that we're going to be pursuing in this class. What is it about him that makes him particularly threatening? We're going to explore that a little bit more. Why was it that Ezekiel was granted visions of God? That's one way of framing it, right? If you take it at face value that he was granted unique visions, why was he granted those visions? Or you could frame it a little differently. Why does the prophet Ezekiel allow himself to have these particular kinds of visions of God? And then what is the overriding meaning of Ezekiel's prophecies, of his visions? And finally, I'm going to end exploring the question of what Ezekiel means for us today in our age. In our age generally, and of course I'm recording this in my kitchen in the middle of the night because we are all confined to quarters during the coronavirus crisis, which is a worldwide crisis that we are living through. And in that regard, living through a crisis and doing our best to grapple with it, for example, by studying Torah, by studying Tanakh over the course of the days between the coronavirus confinement and Pesach, that experience of living through crisis puts us in some ways in a similar situation as Ezekiel, and that might allow us to understand a little more about his vision. Let's look for a second about what is it that makes Ezekiel so threatening? Well, one of the core beliefs of Judaism, seems to me, is that God is invisible, or God has no body or no likeness. That's a pretty well-received Orthodox view, and it has sources in Torah itself. Here might be one of the clearest sources. Here we have in the beginning of the book of Dvarim, of Deuteronomy, Moses addressing the people about what they experienced at Mount Sinai, here referred to under the other name of the mountain as Chorev. And he's retelling to them the story of what it was that they, or perhaps their children, saw at Mount Sinai. And he says, "You came forward and stood at the foot of the mountain. The mountain was ablaze with flames to the very skies, dark with the densest clouds. Vaidaber Adonai alechem mitoch ha'esh." And God, using here the name of God, the Eternal, spoke to you out of the fire. Kol dvarim atem shom'im. You heard the sound of words. Utmuna einchem ro'im. And you did not see any shape with your eyes. You did not, it says perceived, but maybe what we mean is you couldn't see it. You couldn't see it. There was no visual content to this revelation of God. Zulati kol. there was nothing but sound, nothing but a voice. Now, this doesn't explicitly say that God has no physical body or physical appearance. It says that the people did not behold any such appearance. Now, it's possible that that's because God has no body. Certainly, that's the way that Maimonides understands these words. But not only does it leave open the idea that God, in fact, could theoretically be perceived, it's just that the people didn't see it. This account contradicts another account that comes earlier in Torah. So at the actual revelation at Mount Sinai, this comes at the very end of Parashat Mishpatim in Exodus, in Sefer Shmot. We have the beginning of the revelation at Mount Sinai. And then we have this very curious, very cryptic, very terse description of events. Vaya'al Moshe va'Aaron Nadav va'Avihu v'shiv'im ziknei Yisrael. So Moses, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu. I don't know why that happened. Let's change that. We can do that in real time. Nadav and Avihu. And 70 elders of Israel ascended, went up the mountain. Vayir'u. And they saw Et Elohei Yisrael, the God of Israel. They saw the God of Israel. Just in the previous passage, Moses says, you didn't see anything, right? Just go back. It says, Utmuna enchem ro'im. You did not see any image. Here, Vayiru. And they saw Elohei Yisrael, they saw the God of Israel. And not only did they see the God of Israel, v'tachat raglav, and under God's feet, evidently God has feet that they saw, there was something like bricks or a pavement of sapir, which could be sapphire stone, like the very sky for purity. And yet God did not raise his hand against the leaders of the Israelites. Vayechezu et Elohim. They beheld God. Another word for to see. These people saw God, and moreover, they had a party when they did so. Vayochlu, vayishtu, and they ate and they drank. So there are ways, of course, of resolving what Moshe is saying to the people in Deuteronomy and what we read about by tradition, by Moses' own hand in Exodus. There are ways of reconciling it. But perhaps a more straightforward way of reading this is that Moshe is being less than candid when he speaks to the assembled people in the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, there was a vision, and perhaps not the whole of the people, but at least Moses, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, and the 70 elders were granted a vision of God, and God seemed to have been standing or seating over some sort of a glowing sapphire pavement. That is the account of Torah. And you can already see here within Torah itself an attempt to perhaps suppress or to downplay what a vision of God is like. And yet, as we turn now to the prophet Ezekiel, Ezekiel shrugs off this attempt to downplay visions, and he has an extraordinary vision. What I'm going to focus on in this talk is really the three parts of the central vision that Ezekiel has. Ezekiel has many, many oracles throughout his life, but the book of Ezekiel has three distinct episodes, each one interpreting, in a certain sense, the previous one. And no book begins more dramatically and more trippily than the book of Ezekiel. And we not only have a trippy experience, we actually have an absolute date. Vayehi b'shloshim shana b'revi'i b'chamisha l'chodesh. Right? In the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, it says later the 30th year is counting from a certain date, Judah date. But we're dealing here with the 5th year of the exile of Jehoiakim. On the 5th day of the 4th month, which puts this on the 5th of Tammuz, and because we know when Jehoiakim was exiled, which was 598 BCE, That places this in 593 BCE. We have the actual date. On that very date, Va'ani b'toch hagolah, and I was in the midst of the exiles, or the exile, an extraordinary statement. Va'ani b'toch hagolah. I was entirely exiled. Everything about it was exiled, and he knows exactly where he was, al nahar kvar, on this canal running off from the Euphrates River, which I'm going to call Chebar, which is the way it's been translated here, the Kvar Canal. At that point, Niftechu Hashemayim, the heavens opened, V'erei mar'ot Elohim, and I saw visions of God. I saw the appearance of God. I saw God. I saw those things that were reported to have been seen by at least these 74 of the elite of the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. It's an extraordinary moment. Let's look for a second at what it is that he sees. I've cut down this extraordinary first chapter for two reasons. First of all, it's very long and elaborate. Secondly, among the prohibitions is that I'm not allowed to really delve into this chapter. This is Ma'aseh Merkavah. This is the account of the chariot. We'll get there in a second. It is the starting place for Jewish mystical metaphysics, this chapter 1 of Ezekiel, and there are prohibitions on really teaching it. Luckily, I don't know much about it, so I can't teach it in any esoteric way, but I want to just look at some of the imagery. I looked, and lo, a stormy wind came sweeping out of the north, a huge cloud and flashing fire surrounded by radiance, and in the center of it, in the center of the fire, a gleam as of chashmal. We don't know what chashmal is. In modern Hebrew, that's the word for electricity. Here it's translated as amber, some sort of glowing amber. In the center of it were also figures of 4 creatures, and this was their appearance. They were like human beings, but each had 4 faces, and each had 4 wings, and the legs of each were fused into a single leg, and they sparkled, and they glowed, and they had human hands, and the 4 of them had their faces and their wings on their 4 sides. Each one's wings touched those of the other, and so on. Each of them had a human face, and then each of them had the face of a lion on the right. Each of the 4 had the face of an ox on the left, and each of the 4 had the face of an eagle at the back. That's the first image, this bizarre image of human-like figures with human faces, but also the faces of these 4 animals, an ox, a lion, an eagle, and a human face. As I gazed on the creatures, I saw 1 wheel on the ground next to each of the 4-faced creatures. And as for the appearance and structure of the wheels, they gleamed like beryl. All 4 had the same form. The appearance and structure of each was as 2 wheels cutting through each other. Ofan betoch ha'ofan, perhaps a wheel within a wheel. That's the way that the translation has come down to us, wheels within wheels. Somehow the wheels that are going on here are not like ordinary wheels. Perhaps they bisect one another. And when they moved, each could move in the direction of any of its 4 quarters. They did not veer when they moved. Their rims were tall and frightening, and in case stuff wasn't trippy enough, the rims of all 4 were covered all over with eyes. So we have these creatures, and then in some relation to these creatures, we have these wheels that are nothing like earthly wheels. Perhaps they're wheels that move like this. And then above the heads of the creatures was a rakia, an expanse. Rakia is the word in creation for what separates the waters that are above from the sublunar realms below. So there's some sort of an expanse with an awe-inspiring gleam as of crystal. And above that expanse, I've cut out some more here, over their heads was the semblance of a throne. An appearance like sapphire. And on top, upon the semblance of a throne, wait for it, there was the semblance of a human form. Dmut kimar'e Adam. The representation of the likeness of Adam, of a human being. From what appeared as his loins up, I saw a gleam as of amber, what looked like fire encased in flame, and from what appeared as his loins down, I saw what looked like fire. Like the appearance of the bow which shines in the clouds on a day of rain, such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. That was the appearance. Now here's the kicker. That was the appearance of the semblance of the presence of the Lord. Ken mar'eh hanoga savivhu, mar'eh demut kavod Adonai. The presence of God. This is the very presence of God that Moses in the book of Exodus asks God to see, and that request is denied. But here, Ezekiel sees, it seems, what it was that Moses was forbidden to see. Va'epol al panai. Va'apol al panai. And I flung myself down on my face. Va'eshma kol medaber. And I heard the voice of someone speaking. That's the way the book of Ezekiel begins, the famous Ma'aseh Merkavah. But the important thing here is that Ezekiel doesn't know what it means. He doesn't know what's going on. This is what Ezekiel sees, but he doesn't understand it. And in fact, Ezekiel would have to wait 14 months to the day, until he's granted a second vision to understand it. Now here, I brought you a few representations of what this vision is like. Here we have a classical picture by a French artist whose name I don't have, of Ezekiel on the right, and there the heavens are opening, and there in the corner, let's zoom in, we have God. We have God. We've got a lion here, and we have an ox over here, and we have the old man in the sky with the white beard. And here we, of course, have a mistranslation of cherubs. The word's not used in what we've read. We're going to get the word cherub or kruv further on. Here is the vision that Ezekiel is granted. That's one. Perhaps a more famous one is this image by Raphael. I don't know if I can get the whole thing on the screen. Let's try. There we go. Here we have the eagle and the ox. And this perhaps is the lion, but it's a lion with wings. And here again are the kruvim, and here is the likeness of a man seated upon it. These get at some of it. This is quite a beautiful picture. But as I was trying to think through what image am I really given here, I think the best representation perhaps comes from this masterpiece, Watchmen, by Alan Moore and illustrated by Dave Givens. Here is a structure that's created by a man who also is like a god, Dr. Manhattan, the godlike man in the comic book Watchmen. And here is the chariot that Dr. Manhattan builds for himself, on which he floats through the atmosphere of Mars with his girlfriend. As you can see, it is wheels within wheels hovering in the sky. I brought a few more images of it. Here it is hovering over one of the canyons of Mars. And I think it has this otherworldly sense that maybe those other images lack. What we are seeing here is some sort of a vehicle upon which God can ride. But what is that vehicle? Ezekiel doesn't know. He doesn't yet understand until he has his second vision, exactly 14 months later. This is in 594 BCE. No, I'm sorry, that date must be wrong. Let's say, if the first one was 593 BCE, so this is I did the normal thing. This is 592 BCE. 592 BCE. On the 5th of Elul. Let's change that right now. And this is recorded in Ezekiel beginning in chapter 8. In chapter 8, Ezekiel is transported in spirit, and he's brought all the way back to Jerusalem, where he sees a particularly horrific vision. What he sees is that some sort of a figure, somewhat like the angel of death, or the destroyer, as we know this figure in the story of Passover, which we're about to come to, appears, but appears this time not against the enemies of the Jewish people, but against the Jews themselves, or that may be anachronistic, against the Judeans themselves in the temple, and ushers Ezekiel through the temple, showing the ways in which the temple is being profaned, the violence and the idolatry that fills the courtyards of the temple. And then this figure goes through Jerusalem, beginning with the temple, killing people. We come to chapter 10. And in chapter 10, Ezekiel looks again, and he sees that God is seated in this very same way that we saw God before. I looked, and on the expanse over the heads of the kruvim, the cherubs, here don't think of chubby little children, think of exotic chimeras, oxes blended with eagles, mythical creatures. There was something like sapphire stone, an appearance resembling a throne could be seen over them. He, that is God seated there, spoke to the man clothed in linen and said, "Step aside inside the wheelwork, under the kruvim, and fill your hands with glowing coals from among the kruvim and scatter them over the city." And then in verse 4, Vayarom kavod Adonai ma'al hakruv, al miftan habayit. So the presence of God, this appearance of God, lifts off from the kruvim down into the bayit, into the temple itself. And the house, the temple, was filled with cloud, and the court was filled with the radiance of the presence of the Lord. So God, who was confined before this time in the Holy of Holies, is now moving into the courtyard of the temple itself. V'kol kanfei hakruvim nishma al chatzer. The sound of the kruvim's wings could be heard as far as at the outer court, like the voice of El Shaddai when God speaks. And God commanded the man, "Take fire from among the kruvim within the wheelwork," and so on and so forth. And then he starts to understand that what he had seen the first time were in fact kruvim, these mythical creatures that appear in the embroidery inside the temple and are represented on the Aron Kodesh, on the ark of the Aron, not like the Aron that we have in the synagogue, the Aron that's inside the Holy of Holies. Above it are kruvim. And he says, we're in line 15 here, Vayiromu hakruvim, right? The kruvim ascended, and then he says, Hi chaya asher ha'iti bin har kvar. These were the very things that I saw in the Kvar canal. So the kruvim are the things upon which God is seated, and he moves up and down on. And then the presence of the Lord left the platform of the house and stopped above the kruvim. So God is now rising. And if we keep on going a little further, he sees, again, as for the form of their faces, they were the very faces that I had seen by the Kfar Canal, their appearance and their features, and each could move in the direction of any of its faces. And what we realize, maybe it takes a little while to understand what it is that we are seeing, but God is leaving the temple. God is extricating himself from a corrupt temple, so that the temple becomes a shell containing nothing. And now Ezekiel understands what it is that he saw. The reason he had a vision of God seated on a chariot, the strange Dr. Manhattan-like chariot at the Kvar Canal, is because God had left the temple. Not only Ezekiel had got into exile, but God God's self had gone into exile. Ezekiel then lives for a while longer. We're now about 20 years out from the or a little bit less, I take it back, we're about 12 or 13 years out from the destruction of the temple itself. No, that's not right. It's 586. So it's even closer. We're about 6 years away from the destruction of the temple. And Ezekiel prophesies that the temple is going to be destroyed. There is no turning back from that. The temple will fall. The temple will be destroyed. And the reason why the temple will be destroyed is so that the people of Judah will know God. God is revealing God's self to the Jews, to the Judeans, soon to be called the Jews, through destruction. And alas, of course, his prophecies come to pass. And when they come to pass, Ezekiel's mission changes. After the destruction of the temple, after being unrelentingly condemnatory of the Judeans beforehand, he offers a vision of consolation. And that leads us to his third revelation, his third vision, his final vision, which again we have the date for. It was on the 10th of Tishrei in either the year 573 or 572. That is to say, on Yom Kippur, although Ezekiel doesn't call it Yom Kippur. And this begins in chapter 40 of the book of Ezekiel. And I'm looking here at chapter 43, because what he's envisioning here is that following this destruction, there will be terrible, terrible suffering. Many will die, many will be carried into exile, but there will be consolation at the end of days. We have in chapter 37 Ezekiel's vision, metaphorical vision of the Jewish people as corpses splayed out of nothing but bones in a valley, who will come to life again. The bones say to themselves, Avda tikvatenu, all hope is lost. And of course, the national anthem of Israel, Hatikva, takes those words and flips them. Od lo avda tikvatenu, it says, our hope is not yet lost. In that they're echoing, the Hatikva is echoing Ezekiel, who wants to teach the same thing. It may seem that hope was lost, that all hope was lost. Not only were you slaughtered and carried into exile, Jewish people, not only that, but God's self abandoned the city. And yet here he has a vision toward the end of his life of that very same chariot ultimately returning to Jerusalem. Vehine kvod Elohei Yisrael, and here again comes from the east the presence of the God of Israel. And the vision was like the vision I had seen when I came to destroy the city, the very same vision I had seen at the Chebar Canal, at Nahar Kvar. Again, he's still interpreting that initial vision that he was granted and understands that this is the coda to that vision. And again, as in the first case, here, toward the end of his life, Va'ipol el panai, and I fell upon my face. Uchvod Adonai ba el habayit derech shar asher panav derech hakdim. God enters the temple again, re-enters the temple by the gate that faced eastward. And his spirit carried me into the inner court. And again, Vehine melei kavod Adonai habayit, the glory of God, the presence of God fills once again this temple. Va'eshma medaber elai mehabayit ve'ish haya omed etzli, and I heard speech addressed to me as though there was someone standing next to me, talking to me. And what is this word that he hears? Vayomer elai ben adam. He says to me, human being, person, which is how God addresses Ezekiel. Et makom kis'i ve'et makom kapot raglai, asher eshkon sham betoch bnei Yisrael le'olam. You are seeing the place of my throne, the place for the soles of my feet, where I will be enthroned, where I will dwell in the midst of the people Israel forever. The house of Israel and their kings must not again defile my holy name by their apostasy and by the corpses of their kings at their death. Provided the Jews really do tshuva and really reform their ways, despite this terrible punishment, there is consolation, and the presence of God will return yet again to Jerusalem. Those are the three major pieces of Ezekiel's vision, the initial theophany, which is theophany, revelation of God, which rivals what anyone saw at Sinai, something far greater than was seen at Sinai. Then finally, an understanding of what that terrible vision was. It was saying that there was destruction coming. And then once the destruction came, and God had gone into exile with Ezekiel and the exiles to the north, at some future point, Ezekiel was vouchsafed a vision that that chariot would come back and return to the temple, and God would again dwell there. And in fact, at the very, very end of the book of Ezekiel, after he lays out what this temple will look like, it will look very, very different than the first temple that we knew, Solomon's temple, and the second temple that was ultimately built and stood for 500 odd years. It would be a very different temple. And then the land of Israel would be settled somewhat like the land of Israel was settled in the time of Joshua, but also with differences. And the name of Jerusalem would be changed. No longer would it be called Yerushalayim. V'shem ha'ir miyom, from that day forward, the name of the city will be Adonai Shama. The Lord is there. It will be known as the place where God lives. By most understandings, and I can certainly say mine, that final vision of God's return to Jerusalem is speaking to a future we still have not seen. Despite the return of so many of the Jewish people to the land of Israel and the building up of Jerusalem, it's still, after all, called Jerusalem and not Adonai Shama. And in fact, 3 times a day in our daily prayers, in the Amidah, we bless God as Hamachazir Shchinato L'Tzion, the one who will cause his Shechina, his presence, which Ezekiel here calls the Kavod, the one who will return his presence to Mount Zion, that is to say, to the Temple Mount. Hamachazir Shchinato L'Tzion means that it is perhaps an ongoing process, or perhaps a future process, but it's not a process which has concluded. We are still awaiting the return of the glory of God to the temple. And that is what Ezekiel teaches us. Now, Ezekiel is so important because this idea of Galut HaShechina, that not only the Jewish people, but God's presence itself was exiled from Jerusalem and one day will return, is born with Ezekiel. Ezekiel's vision is one that, in a certain sense, creates the blueprint for subsequent Judaism. Why then did we say it was dangerous? Well, I already indicated one reason. God is seen in visual terms in a way that seems to contradict, at least, if not the law, then the spirit of so much of what we read in Torah itself. Ezekiel's vision does not correspond to the way in which the second temple was actually built. Ezekiel has blueprints for a temple which looks nothing like the dimensions of the temple and the rituals that were supposed to take place in the temple, as we understand them from the Torah. And as I said, in a certain sense, Ezekiel has a vision which is even greater than Moses's. That might be the final way in which it contradicts words of Torah. As I said, Moses was denied access to actually beholding God, and yet, without even asking for it, Ezekiel was granted it. Now, we saw in the very beginning that there have been rabbinic attempts to reconcile Ezekiel with the tradition as we have it, but in fact, Ezekiel is really and truly dangerous. He's really and truly dangerous because he is unsettling the framework of Torah-based Judaism. Remember that the rabbis declare that the age of prophecy comes to a close at a certain point. The reason they do that is because prophecy can always be renewed, can always become something new again. It's true that the Torah says at the very end of Deuteronomy, there never arose a prophet like Moses again, but that's what the Torah says. Perhaps there will be one day. And in a certain sense, that's what Ezekiel is saying of himself. Without threatening Moses explicitly, he is looking at reality, looking behind reality. in a way that seems to be forbidden by Torah itself. If there is an image that might kind of sum up who Ezekiel was, it's this well-known image which we see at all sorts of medieval fairs and stuff like that, of an astronomer or a philosopher or a metaphysician or a psychonaut being unsatisfied with the world as he finds it and peeking behind the curtain of reality and seeing there wheels within wheels. The way things are behind the appearance of things. That is what psychedelics promise. They promise to tear apart the curtain of the world as we have it. And I said to you that at the end I was going to reflect a little bit on why Ezekiel was having this vision when he did and what it speaks to, what it says to us in our day. I think it's not coincidental that we started with Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds with the psychedelic age, because there are times in civilizations when it feels as though they are in real crisis and truths and order that we took for granted are becoming unsettled. I think it is fair to say that in the world today, we have this feeling that the world is coming apart at the seams in all sorts of ways. Certainly this crisis is reinforcing that. And in the 60s, there was a similar sense that there was a breakdown of received norms. The age of Aquarius was dawning, and it was time to look behind the curtain. Why, however, look behind the curtain at those moments? Well, when things are going well, we have a sense that the world is well ordered and things are happening the way they should be. Right? In the Jewish tradition, the name for this idea is hashgacha, oversight, providence, that God is looking down and is setting things in motion the way they should be. Events are telling us that there is an order and a logic to the universe. However, when we experience moments of breakdown and real crisis, and truths that we took for granted no longer seem to be satisfying, or values that we hold, deeply held values, no longer seem to be reinforced in public, or to use the language of Psalm 92, when the wicked are prospering and the doers of evil are succeeding, when the unqualified and the worst are filled with conviction and are rising to the top, and the best are failing. When the world seems out of joint, I think to that moment that we need to look behind the nature of things, to try to get a peek into the way things really are, to try to understand how it is that appearances are deceiving us so much. How can it be in Ezekiel's time that God's own temple, the God of the universe, is destroyed? How can it be that God's people are suffering? Ezekiel really has no other choice than to have the heavens open up in just this way, so that he can see the way things really are inside. And I think we're living through a time in which we have the very same need. I want to put a pitch in here for a dear friend of mine, Rabbi Zach Kamenetz, who is working deeply with psychedelic experience, with mystical experience. And perhaps we prefer the word, psychedelics was one term that was chosen for substances or the achieving of states of consciousness in which you see behind the nature of things. Psychedelics are one word for that. Psychedelic means mind manifesting. But another word is entheogen. And entheogen means these are substances within which you can come to know God. God is within them, entheogens. As Rabbi Zach Kamenetz has the Jewish entheogen project, in which he is trying to restore this tradition which comes to the surface really for the first time with Ezekiel. And the question of why the Jewish Entheogen Project appears right now, I think can be answered by thinking of it this way. We are at a time of breakdown and tremendous confusion. And many of us, certainly myself included, will look to figures like Ezekiel more and more, despite the danger they pose to orthodoxy, both small and big O orthodoxy, because they represent another tradition, and a tradition that unsettles things and that is unsatisfied with the world as it is and wants to peek behind the curtain one more time, to see the way things really are. That is what makes Ezekiel both dangerous and also perhaps the prophet for our moment. So I'm recording this on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. It is the first of the months for us, the beginning of the dawn of redemption according to our tradition. May it be so. I hope you are all safe in your homes. I hope this was interesting to you. Thank you to Shira Hecht Kohler and to the 929 Project, and Chag Sameach.